A quiet bar, an ordinary morning, until danger walks through the door. A demand is made, tensions rise, and one wrong move could change everything. Will courage stand its ground, or will fear take over? Watch till the end to see how it all unfolds. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more intense stories. The morning air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of a city not yet fully awake. The sky was still a muted shade of gray, with the first hints of dawn creeping over the horizon. A few streetlights flickered as if reluctant to yield to the coming daylight. The roads were mostly empty, save for a few early commuters and the occasional cat darting into an alleyway. It was the kind of morning that felt frozen in time, where the world seemed to pause before the chaos of the day truly began. I pulled up in my old black pickup truck, the tires rolling over the cracked pavement in a steady rhythm. The engine let out a soft rumble before I shut it off, leaning back against the seat for a brief moment. The silence was comforting. This was my ritual. Every morning before the world caught up with me, I came here, to a small, unassuming bar nestled between two larger buildings. It wasn't anything fancy, but it had character, and more importantly, it was one of the few places where I could enjoy a quiet cup of coffee without interruption. The neon sign above the entrance was still dark, its glow not yet needed. The wooden doors were slightly worn, the paint chipping at the edges, but they held firm like a sentinel standing watch over a place that had seen its fair share of stories. This bar had history. You could feel it in the air, in the aged wood of the counters, in the quiet hum of the old jukebox that sat in the corner, untouched at this hour. I knew I wasn't alone. Through the windshield, I saw her. Kira, the owner of this little sanctuary. She had taken over the bar after her father passed away, determined to keep his dream alive. She was young, but there was steel in her eyes, an unshakable resilience that spoke louder than words. As she stepped outside to unlock the doors, she noticed my truck and gave me a knowing smile. "Mornin', Chuck," she greeted, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had been awake for hours, despite the early hour. I nodded. "Morning, Kira." She pushed the door open, stepping inside as she tied her apron around her waist. The sound of the lock clicking back into place was familiar, comforting. I followed her in, the scent of freshly brewed coffee already filling the air. "Same as always?" she asked, moving behind the counter without missing a beat. I gave her a small smirk. "You already know the answer." She chuckled, shaking her head as she reached for a clean cup. Her movements were practiced, effortless. The way she handled herself, quick, precise, always in control, was something I respected. She worked hard, harder than most, and yet there was always a quiet ease about her, as if she had made peace with the long hours and the weight of responsibility. As she placed the steaming cup of coffee in front of me, she leaned against the counter with a curious look. "You're early today," she noted. "Even for you." I took a slow sip of the coffee before answering. "I like the quiet. If I come later, it gets too noisy." Kira smirked. "Not a fan of conversation?" I shrugged. "Not before coffee." The comfortable silence between us stretched on. She moved away, beginning her morning prep, wiping down the counters, checking the inventory, making sure everything was in place before the first regulars arrived. The bar was still empty, save for the two of us. But soon, the city outside would wake up, and this place would be filled with life once again. For now, it was peaceful. The minutes ticked by, the hum of the coffee machine blending into the quiet rhythm of the morning. Outside, the world was beginning to stir. A few pedestrians passed by the front window, their breath visible in the cold morning air. In the distance, the faint sound of traffic was growing, a reminder that the day was about to begin. I finished my coffee, folding my newspaper as I glanced at the clock. I had gotten what I came for. My moment of peace before the world truly woke up. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a few bills and setting them on the counter before stretching my arms and preparing to leave. Then I heard it. The sound of tires rolling up to the curb outside. At first, it was nothing out of the ordinary, just another car pulling up. But then the engine cut off and the unmistakable click of a car door opening followed. My gut told me something was off. Kira noticed it too. She tensed slightly, her hands pausing in the middle of stacking glasses. Then the door opened. The moment the figures stepped inside, I knew. There were 3 of them, dressed in dark suits, their jackets expensive, their shoes polished. But there was something off about them, something calculated. Their movements were too deliberate, their gazes too sharp. These weren't regular customers. They weren't here for a drink. They were here for something else. The man in the center stepped forward, adjusting his cuffs with an air of casual dominance. His hair was slicked back, his jaw set in a way that spoke of someone who was used to being obeyed. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Kira for a moment before his lips curled into a slow, predatory smirk. "Nice place," he said, his voice smooth but laced with something colder beneath the surface. "Cozy." Kira didn't react, didn't flinch. "If you're here for a drink, order. If not, the door's behind you." The man chuckled, shaking his head as if amused. "You've got guts, I'll give you that." He leaned on the counter, his fingers tapping against the wood. "But let's cut the small talk. We both know why I'm here." Silence stretched between them. I didn't move. Not yet. Kira's jaw tightened. "I told your people already. I don't pay for protection." The man exhaled through his nose as if disappointed. "See, that's the thing," he said, his tone still casual but with an edge creeping in. "You don't get a choice in the matter. This isn't about whether you want to. It's about whether you understand how things work in this city." He glanced around the bar, his smirk widening. "Your father understood," he added. Kira's eyes darkened. That was the wrong thing to say. "Get out," she said, her voice steady, but there was steel behind it now. The man sighed dramatically, shaking his head. "You really want to do this the hard way?" He turned slightly, nodding toward one of his men. The second man stepped forward, his fingers flexing as if itching for an excuse. My grip tightened around the coffee cup. They didn't notice me. Not yet. The first man leaned in closer to Kira, his voice dropping. "Last chance, sweetheart. Pay up or things start getting messy." Kira didn't answer. The man smirked, and then, with a flick of his wrist, he grabbed the nearest glass and smashed it against the counter, shards scattering across the wood. The silence in the bar deepened. I exhaled slowly, setting down my empty cup. They still hadn't noticed me. That was about to change. The sound of the shattered glass echoed through the bar like a gunshot, sharp and final. The silence that followed was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Kira remained still, her hands resting against the counter, her expression unreadable. But I saw the way her jaw tightened, the way her fingers curled slightly. She was holding herself back, keeping control. For now. The man in the suit, Vito, smirked, the glint of amusement in his eyes darkening into something cruel. He leaned in closer, placing both hands on the counter as if he owned the place. His men stood behind him, their postures relaxed but ready. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to make a statement. "You got a real smart mouth," Vito murmured, his voice smooth but edged with something sharp. "That's a problem." Kira met his gaze without flinching. "No, the problem is you thinking you can walk in here and tell me what to do." One of the men chuckled, low and mocking. "She's got balls, I'll give her that." Vito smirked, tapping his fingers against the counter. "Yeah, but balls don't mean much when you're 6 feet under." That was when I stood up. It was a slow, deliberate movement, the scrape of my chair against the floor slicing through the silence like a blade. The shift in the room was immediate. For the first time since they entered, Vito and his men turned their attention to me. The smirk on his face wavered slightly, not gone but less certain. He hadn't noticed me before, or maybe he had, but he hadn't thought I was worth worrying about. That was his mistake. Vito straightened, his eyes flicking over me, assessing. "And who the hell are you?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I took my time stepping forward, my boots clicking against the wooden floor with each measured step. I stopped just beside Kira, placing my hand on the counter with an ease that didn't match the storm building behind my eyes. "I'm the guy telling you to walk out that door while you still can," I said calmly. His men shifted slightly, exchanging glances. Vito, to his credit, didn't react right away. He let out a slow breath, then chuckled, shaking his head. "You serious?" I didn't blink. He exhaled through his nose, rolling his shoulders. "All right, old man, let's get something straight. You don't tell me what to do. You don't tell me how this goes. I decide that." One of his men stepped forward, a stocky guy with a thick neck and fists the size of bricks. "I think someone needs a reminder of who's in charge," he said, voice laced with amusement. Vito nodded, still watching me. "Yeah, I think he does." I sighed, and then, before anyone could move, my fist met the thick-necked guy's jaw with enough to send him crashing into the table behind him. The impact was brutal, wood splintering as his body went limp and collapsed to the floor. For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. The second guy lunged at me, but I was faster. I sidestepped his attack, catching his arm mid-swing and twisting it sharply. A sharp, pained grunt escaped his lips before I drove my elbow into his gut, knocking the air from his lungs. He crumpled, hitting the ground hard. The third guy hesitated, his hand twitching toward his jacket, toward a weapon. I closed the distance before he could even think about pulling it out. My knee connected with his ribs, and before he could recover, I grabbed the back of his head and slammed it against the counter. His body went slack instantly. That left one. Vito. He hadn't moved, his smirk long gone. His eyes flicked between his fallen men and me, something new creeping into his expression, something that hadn't been there before. Fear. I rolled my shoulders, shaking off the tension. "Still feel like you're in charge?" He clenched his jaw, nostrils flaring. His hand twitched at his side, but he didn't reach for anything. Not yet. Kira finally moved, stepping around the counter. She was calm, her voice steady. "I think you overstayed your welcome." Vito swallowed, then forced a laugh, though it sounded weaker now. "You think this is over?" He took a slow step back toward the door. "You just made a big mistake." I took a step forward, making sure he understood exactly what kind of mistake he had made. "No," I said. "You did." His lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with one last glare, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the bar. His men, still groaning on the floor, scrambled after him as best they could. The door swung shut. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Then Kira let out a slow breath, running a hand through her hair. "Well, that was something." I exhaled, rolling out my shoulders. You all right? She looked around at the mess. Broken furniture, spilled drinks, unconscious men who would be feeling this for weeks. I don't know if I should be relieved or pissed that I have to clean this up. I smirked. I'll help. She raised an eyebrow. You? Helping clean? I shrugged. I made a mess, least I can do. She let out a short laugh, shaking her head. You're something else, Chuck. I didn't answer. My mind was elsewhere, because I knew this wasn't over. Men like Vito didn't just walk away. They regrouped, they got angrier, they came back. And next time, they wouldn't make the mistake of underestimating me. The bar was quieter than usual after the fight. The regulars who had witnessed what happened either left in a hurry or stayed, murmuring amongst themselves, stealing nervous glances toward the door as if expecting trouble to return at any moment. Kira moved through the wreckage with a focused efficiency, sweeping up broken glass, righting overturned chairs, and wiping the counter clean of spilled drinks. She was calm, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she avoided looking at the door for too long. She was waiting, just like I was. I sat back at my usual stool, my body still loose from the fight, but my mind sharp. I knew how men like Vito operated. They didn't walk away from a loss like this. They stewed, they planned, they came back harder, meaner, with something to prove. And when they did, they wouldn't be stupid enough to send the same 3 guys who were now licking their wounds somewhere in a dark alley. Kira exhaled, tossing the last of the broken glass into a bin before turning to me. You know they're coming back, right? I met her gaze, my expression steady. Yeah. She let out a dry chuckle, shaking her head. Great, just what I needed. I watched her for a moment. She was tough, tougher than most, but she wasn't reckless. She knew what kind of trouble she was dealing with, and she knew what it meant. Still, she wasn't backing down. I respected that. You can still walk away from this, I said. Close up shop. Take a break. Let them think they scared you off. Kira scoffed. That what you'd do? I gave a small smirk. Not a chance. Then don't insult me by suggesting it. I nodded. Fair enough. Before I could say anything else, the front door swung open. For a brief second, I expected to see Vito storming back in, rage in his eyes and reinforcements at his back. But it wasn't him. It was a man in his late 50s, his uniform crisp, his face lined with the weight of years spent dealing with the worst parts of the city. Officer Taylor. He stepped inside, taking a slow glance around the bar, his eyes narrowing at the broken furniture, the scuffed-up floor, and the faint scent of blood still lingering in the air. He let out a long breath and walked toward the counter, leaning against it with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and irritation. I heard you had some visitors, he said, directing his words at Kira but cutting his eyes toward me. She crossed her arms. They weren't exactly here for happy hour. Taylor sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I figured as much. We've been hearing things, rumors. Vito and his people have been stirring up trouble all over town looking for new places to squeeze. He tapped his fingers against the wood. You turned them away. That's going to put a target on your back. Kira's expression didn't change. I'm not paying them a damn cent. Taylor shook his head. I respect that, but you need to understand what you're up against. These guys aren't just some street thugs looking for a quick payday. They've been at this a long time. They know how to make people fold. He glanced at me again. And they know how to hold grudges. I took a sip of my coffee, setting the cup down before meeting his gaze. They come back, I'll be ready. Taylor snorted. Yeah, I saw what you did to the first batch. Not bad for an old man. I smirked. They were sloppy. He chuckled, but it was short-lived. His expression hardened. Listen, Chuck, I've been on the force long enough to know how this goes. You humiliate guys like Vito. They don't just let it slide. They regroup. They come back meaner, with more guys, more weapons. You think you can handle 3 or 4 of them? What about 10? What about 20? I didn't answer. Taylor sighed. Look, I can't post an officer outside your door 24/7, but I can keep an eye on things. You see anything suspicious, you call me. Kira nodded. Appreciate it, Taylor. He straightened, exhaling through his nose. I mean it, Kira. Be careful. These guys don't take public humiliation well, and from what I'm hearing, they're already planning something. She frowned. What do you mean? Taylor hesitated, then lowered his voice. Word is they're gathering people, not just their regular muscle. They're reaching out, calling in favors. They're pissed. He looked between the two of us. Whatever they're planning, it's not going to be small. A thick silence settled over the bar. Kira didn't speak, but I saw the flicker of understanding in her eyes. She knew what this meant. So did I. Taylor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I'll do what I can, but just keep your head on a swivel. With that, he turned and headed for the door, pausing briefly before stepping outside. And, Chuck? I raised an eyebrow. You ever think about taking it easy? Maybe picking up a hobby that doesn't involve breaking bones? I smirked. You ever think about getting better coffee at the station? Taylor chuckled, shaking his head before disappearing out the door. The moment he was gone, Kira leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. Well, that was comforting. I didn't say anything. She glanced at me. So, what now? I took another sip of coffee, letting the silence stretch for a moment before setting the cup down. Now, we wait. She exhaled, shaking her head. You really don't know how to take a quiet morning, do you? I smirked. Not my style. The tension in the air didn't fade. If anything, it thickened, because we both knew the truth. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The stillness of the night felt unnatural. The usual hum of the city outside the bar was there. The occasional honk of a car, the murmur of distant conversations, but something about it felt off. It was too quiet, too expectant, like the city itself was holding its breath. I sat at my usual spot, my coffee cup untouched, my eyes fixed on the door. Kira moved behind the counter, her movements steady but tense. She was trying to act normal, but I could see it in the way she glanced toward the entrance, in the way her fingers tapped against the counter, restless. She was waiting, just like I was. The conversation with Taylor had confirmed what I already knew. Vito and his people weren't done. They had taken a hit, but men like that didn't just walk away. They regrouped, they got angrier, they came back with a plan. And when they did, they wouldn't make the same mistake of underestimating me. The night stretched on, the bar slowly emptying as the last of the regulars finished their drinks and made their way home. The air inside was thick, charged with anticipation. Kira leaned against the counter, exhaling slowly. You still think they'll come tonight? I didn't look away from the door. Yeah. She nodded, running a hand through her hair. Figured. Minutes ticked by, dragging into what felt like hours. Then it happened. The low, guttural roar of motorcycle engines shattered the quiet. Not just one or two, more. The deep growls of their engines filled the street, growing louder as they approached, a slow, deliberate arrival. Then, just as suddenly, the noise cut off, plunging the street back into silence. Heavy footsteps followed, slow and controlled. They wanted to be heard before they were seen. Kira tensed. I set my coffee down. The door swung open. This time they didn't kick it in. They didn't storm inside like before, trying to intimidate with brute force. No, this was different. They walked in slow, controlled, like men who had already decided how this was going to end. Vito was there, his wrist now wrapped in a brace, his face still carrying the bruises from our last encounter. But he wasn't alone. There were more of them now, 7 in total. Their suits were gone, replaced with leather jackets, some with gloves, some with chains wrapped around their fists. These weren't just his usual guys. He had brought in muscle. The bar fell into an eerie silence. The few remaining customers who hadn't left yet froze, their drinks forgotten, their movements stilled. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just a visit. This was a message. Vito stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Kira. "You made a big mistake," he said, his voice low but dangerous. Kira didn't move. "You're back." His lips curled. "Did you really think this was over?" She exhaled through her nose. "I was hoping it was." The bikers chuckled darkly. Vito leaned on the counter, his fingers drumming against the wood. "You embarrassed us," he continued. "Made us look weak. And him," he gestured toward me without even looking at me. "He got in the way of something that didn't concern him." I finally moved, sitting up straighter, but I didn't say anything yet. Vito's eyes flicked back to Kira. "So now we settle this the right way." I spoke, my voice calm but firm. "You mean your way?" Vito turned to face me fully for the first time. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you?" He shook his head. "You don't get it. This isn't about you." His expression darkened. "This is about respect." I tilted my head slightly. "You want respect?" I leaned forward just a bit, my tone steady. "Earn it." Vito's jaw tensed. His men shifted slightly, restless. The tension in the air became suffocating. Then, without warning, he grabbed a bottle from the bar and swung it at my head. I moved fast. I dodged the attack effortlessly, the bottle smashing harmlessly against the counter. Before Vito could react, my fist met his stomach with brutal precision, knocking the wind out of him. He staggered back, coughing, his face twisted in pain. Then the bar exploded into chaos. The bikers lunged forward, and I moved like a force of nature. I grabbed the closest one and drove my knee into his ribs before slamming him onto a table. Another swung at me, but I blocked it effortlessly and countered with a brutal elbow to the jaw, sending him crumbling to the ground. Vito recovered, wiping his mouth, his rage now boiling over. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. "Enough of this," he growled. My eyes locked onto the blade, my body shifting, prepared. Kira saw the knife and acted without thinking. She grabbed the closest heavy object, a metal tray, and swung it with all her strength. The impact against Vito's wrist made him grunt in pain, the knife slipping from his grasp and clattering to the floor. I took the opportunity. I grabbed Vito by the collar, twisted my body, and slammed him down onto the counter. He groaned, dazed, his limbs weak. The remaining bikers hesitated. 2 of them were still conscious, but they saw what had happened. They weren't winning this fight. Then the sirens blared. The red and blue lights flashed outside, reflecting off the windows. The doors burst open as officers stormed in, guns drawn, their voices commanding the room. "Everybody down." The 2 remaining bikers immediately raised their hands, knowing they had no chance now. Vito groaned under my grip, his energy completely drained. Officer Taylor stepped forward, surveying the scene. He let out a sharp breath. What did I say about keeping your head on a swivel? I smirked slightly but said nothing. The officers moved quickly, restraining the bikers and escorting them out one by one. Vito was the last to be taken. His glare burned into me and Kira as he was dragged toward the door. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice hoarse. I didn't even look at him. "Yeah, it is." The officers hauled the last of them outside, the doors swinging shut behind them. The silence that followed was heavy but different. It wasn't tense. It was relieved. Kira exhaled, finally letting go of the tray she had been gripping so tightly. She turned to me, shaking her head in disbelief. "You really don't know how to take a quiet morning, do you?" I chuckled. "Guess not." Officer Taylor approached, shaking his head. "You know, I should start charging you for all these visits." Kira rolled her eyes. "Put it on my tab." Taylor smirked. "We'll make sure these guys don't come back. They're going away for a while." He nodded toward me. "And you? I don't know if I should be thanking you or arresting you for destruction of property." I shrugged. "They started it." Taylor sighed, rubbing his forehead. Yeah. He gave Kira a nod. "You need anything, you call." "Thanks, Taylor." With that, the officers left, taking the last of the chaos with them. The bar was a mess. Broken tables, shattered glass, chairs scattered everywhere. But it was over. Kira leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. "I should probably be freaking out right now." I sat back down at my usual spot, completely unfazed. "But you're not." She exhaled, shaking her head. "No, I'm not." She looked around at the mess, then back at me. "You sticking around for another drink?" I smirked. "Like always." She chuckled, grabbing a clean glass. The city outside was awake now, the chaos fading into the background. And despite everything, despite the fight, the threats, the danger, one thing was clear. This was her bar, and no one was ever taking it from her. The morning after the fight, the bar was quieter than usual. The regulars still came in, but there was a strange tension in the air, as if the events of the previous night hadn't fully settled in their minds. Kira moved through her routine with practiced ease, cleaning glasses, setting up tables, and checking supplies. Every now and then, she caught someone whispering about what had happened, about the bikers, about me. My name had spread quickly. People had seen what happened, and even those who hadn't been there now knew the story. Despite everything, Kira seemed calmer than I expected. She had stood her ground, refused to be intimidated, and even though she knew it could have gone differently, she was proud of herself. She wasn't the type to run. That much was clear. Then there was me. The way I had stepped in without hesitation, the way I had effortlessly taken control of the situation. It still played in her mind, I could tell. She wasn't used to having someone fight her battles. She had spent too long handling things on her own. She was wiping down the counter when the door opened. I stepped inside the way I always did. No grand entrance, no unnecessary noise. Just the quiet presence of a man who had been here 1,000 times before. A few of the regulars glanced at me, some with nods of appreciation, others with thinly veiled curiosity. The ones who had seen the fight firsthand looked at me differently now. Kira smirked as I took my usual seat at the bar. "Back already?" I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "Like always." She grabbed a glass and started preparing my usual drink. "You've been the talk of the town," she said. "People are still trying to wrap their heads around what happened yesterday." I didn't react much. People like to talk. She set the glass in front of me. Yeah, but this time they're talking about how you knocked out 3 guys like it was nothing. I took a slow sip of my drink. They started it. Kira chuckled, shaking her head. And you finished it. Before the conversation could continue, the door swung open again. A man stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. He wasn't a regular. His suit was clean but slightly wrinkled, his expression tense. He spotted Kira immediately and approached the bar without hesitation. "You the owner?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Kira straightened up. "Yeah, can I help you?" The man glanced around as if checking to see if anyone was listening. Then he leaned in slightly. "I heard what happened here yesterday with those bikers." Kira's expression darkened slightly. "Yeah? And?" The man exhaled. "They've been doing this all over town. I run a diner a few blocks away. Last week they came in and did the same thing. Harassed my staff, smashed some tables, scared off customers. I didn't know what to do. I thought calling the cops would only make it worse." I listened quietly, my expression unreadable as he continued. "They came back yesterday," he said, "right after they left here." Kira's fingers tensed around the cloth she was holding. "They went straight to your place?" The man nodded. "They were angry, said they had unfinished business. They broke a window, knocked over some chairs, said they weren't done with this neighborhood." He hesitated. "I wanted to ask, do you think they'll come back here?" Kira exhaled slowly, exchanging a glance with me. "They're not the kind of people who like losing," I finally said. The man swallowed hard. "That's what I was afraid of." Kira frowned. "You didn't call the cops?" The man shook his head. "What's the point? They'd be gone by the time the police got there. And even if they got arrested, they'd just come back angrier." A heavy silence settled over the bar. The reality of the situation was clear. These men weren't just some punks looking for trouble. They were used to getting their way. And now that someone had stood up to them, they weren't going to let it slide. I finished my drink and set the glass down. "If they come back, I'll be here." The man looked at me, then at Kira. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" Kira smirked. "The last time they were here, they left in handcuffs." The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I just wanted to warn you. Be careful." With that, he turned and left, the door swinging shut behind him. Kira leaned against the counter, deep in thought. "So, they're not done," she muttered. I remained quiet for a moment before finally saying, "They never are." She looked at me. "You've dealt with people like this before." My expression remained steady. "More than you know." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "Great, just what I needed." The rest of the morning passed in a strange sort of quiet. The usual customers came and went, but the feeling of unease remained. The conversation with the diner owner had changed things. Before, it had felt like the fight was over. Now, it felt like the beginning of something bigger. I stayed at the bar longer than usual. I could have left, gone about my day, but I didn't. I sat at my usual spot, my presence solid and unwavering. Kira knew without me saying it that I was staying just in case, and for the first time since the fight, she felt just a little safer. The tension in the air was heavier than ever. The conversation with the diner owner had confirmed what both Kira and I already suspected. The bikers weren't done. They had been humiliated, and men like them didn't let things go. They would come back. It was only a matter of when. I remained in the bar longer than usual, my presence as steady as ever. I didn't speak much, but I didn't need to. Kira could tell I was thinking through the situation, calculating the possibilities in my head. I'd been in situations like this before. I knew how these kinds of men operated. They didn't just disappear after one loss. They regrouped, got angrier, and came back with a plan. Kira moved through her usual routine, but she was more alert than before. She glanced at the door more often, expecting at any moment to hear the roar of engines outside. The customers seemed to feel it too. There was an unusual quiet in the bar, an unspoken awareness that trouble was brewing. Some of the regulars who had seen the fight the day before kept looking toward me, as if reassured by my presence. The afternoon passed without incident, but as the sun began to set, the tension only grew. Kira found herself glancing at the clock more frequently, counting the hours. When the front door opened just after dusk, she felt a brief jolt of anxiety until she saw that it wasn't the bikers. Officer Taylor stepped inside, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He walked straight up to the bar and leaned against the counter. "Kira," he greeted, then glanced at me. "Chuck." I gave him a small nod. Taylor exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I've been hearing things, rumors." Kira frowned. "What kind of rumors?" Taylor glanced around before lowering his voice. "The bikers. Word is they're planning something. Nothing concrete yet, but my guys have been keeping their ears to the ground. Whatever they're thinking, it's not good." Kira's stomach tightened, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "They're that mad about what happened?" Taylor scoffed. "Men like them? Yeah, they don't take public humiliation well, especially not from a woman." He jerked his head toward me. "And definitely not from someone like him." I remained calm. "What do you know?" Taylor sighed. "Not much, just that they've been talking, gathering people, trying to figure out their next move. We're keeping an eye on them, but they're smart enough to know when we're watching." Kira crossed her arms. "So what? We just wait until they show up again?" Taylor hesitated, then nodded. "Pretty much." Kira exhaled sharply. "Great." Taylor gave her a serious look. "You need to be careful, Kira. I mean it. These guys are dangerous." She met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not scared of them." Taylor studied her for a moment, then smirked slightly. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." He straightened, glancing at me again. "You sticking around?" I nodded once. Taylor exhaled. "Good. I'd rather have you here than anywhere else." He tapped the counter lightly. "Just keep your head on a swivel." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving the bar in a heavy silence. Kira ran a hand through her hair. Well, that was comforting. I remained quiet, my expression unreadable. The minutes ticked by. The bar slowly filled with its usual evening crowd, but the tension never faded. Kira kept working, but her mind was elsewhere, running through the possibilities. Would the bikers come tonight? Tomorrow? Would they bring more people? Were they armed? She caught me watching the door more often, my posture relaxed but ready. I wasn't the type to wait for trouble. I was the type to prepare for it. Finally, as the night wore on and the bar began to wind down, Kira sighed. "How long are you planning to sit there?" I smirked. "Until I don't need to," she exhaled, shaking her head. "And here I thought you just liked the drinks." I chuckled but didn't respond. The night stretched on, but nothing happened. No roaring engines, no broken doors, no threats. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. It just meant it was coming. The battle is over, but the story doesn't end here. Some fights leave scars and some victories change everything. What would you have done in this situation? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more intense stories.